I always thought the phrase, rock bottom, was overused, some kind of motivational cliché you saw in self-help books. But when I found the eviction notice taped to my apartment door, I understood it in a way I never wanted to. The notice was straightforward and cold. I had 7 days to leave. No appeals, no extensions. My stomach twisted as I read it again and again, hoping I'd misunderstood. But there was no mistake. I sat on the floor of my nearly empty apartment, the shadows of unpaid bills piled on the counter taunting me. A month ago, I'd been an assistant manager at a retail store. Now, I had no job, no savings, and no one to call. It felt like my life was unraveling thread by thread, and all I could do was watch. When you're forced to leave everything behind, you learn what really matters. I stared at the cardboard box in front of me, trying to decide what to take. My childhood photo album went in first, a collection of fading memories of better times. Then a handful of clothes, a journal I hadn't written in for months, and a book I'd meant to read but never got around to. In the corner of the box, buried under old receipts and papers, I found a bundle of envelopes tied with a ribbon. I almost threw them away, but something stopped me. I stuffed them into the box without looking and closed it shut. I didn't know it then, but those letters would change everything. The first night was the hardest. I spent it in my car, parked in the back of a grocery store parking lot. The engine hummed faintly as I tried to stay warm, but the biting cold seeped in anyway. I thought about my parents, wondering if they'd even care if they knew where I was. We hadn't spoken in years, not since the fallout that had left us more like strangers than family. That night, sleep didn't come. The darkness felt too heavy, and the silence was deafening. On the third day, I couldn't avoid it anymore. I parked outside Haven Hope Shelter, gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing holding me together. The building was a drab, gray structure with a worn sign hanging over the entrance. People lingered outside, their faces worn and tired. I felt a wave of shame as I walked inside. I didn't belong here, I thought. But the truth was, I had nowhere else to go. The shelter manager, Martha, greeted me with a tired smile. "First time here?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. I nodded. "Don't worry," she said, handing me a clipboard. "We'll get you settled." The shelter was crowded, its walls echoing with the sound of too many people in too small a space. Martha explained the rules as she led me to a bunk in the women's dormitory. "No drugs, no alcohol, no violence," she said, her tone sharp. "Curfew's at 9 p.m., and if you don't sign in every day, we'll give your spot to someone else." I nodded, trying to absorb it all. "Dinner's at 6, she added. "And don't worry, everyone here started out scared. You'll find your footing." Dinner that night was a simple meal of spaghetti and bread, served on chipped plastic trays. I sat alone at first, too overwhelmed to make eye contact with anyone. Eventually, a man about my age slid into the seat across from me. "First day?" he asked, his voice kind. I nodded. "I'm Jerome," he said, holding out his hand. "Claire," I replied, shaking it hesitantly. Jerome smiled. "It gets easier, I promise." Well, as easy as this can get. Over the next few days, I adjusted to shelter life. It wasn't easy. Privacy was non-existent, the dorm was loud at all hours, and the faint smell of bleach clung to everything. But there were moments of kindness, too. Jerome introduced me to Ellen, an older woman who seemed to know everyone's name and always had a kind word. "She's like the shelter's grandma," Jerome joked. Ellen offered me a warm smile. "We look out for each other here, sweetheart. That's how we get through." Not everyone in the shelter was as kind as Jerome and Ellen. Tensions often flared over the smallest things, a missing pair of socks, a loud snore, a line that moved too slowly. One night, a fight broke out in the men's dormitory, the shouts echoing through the building. Martha broke it up quickly, but the incident left everyone on edge. It's the stress, Jerome explained later. Being here, it changes people. Some of us handle it better than others. One night, unable to sleep, I decided to go through the box I'd packed before leaving my apartment. That's when I found the letters again, the bundle of envelopes tied with a ribbon. They were from my mother. The return address was from a town in Nebraska, a place I barely remembered. I hesitated before opening the first one. Dear Claire, I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, but I hope you'll read this anyway. I'm sorry for how things ended between us. If you ever want to talk, you can reach me at this address. The letter was dated 2 years ago. I read every letter that night, each one a mix of apology and longing. My mother's words stirred emotions I hadn't felt in years, anger, sadness, but also hope. Could I really reach out after so much time? What would she say if she knew how far I'd fallen? The next morning, I showed the letters to Jerome. What would you do? I asked. He studied them for a moment before replying. Family's complicated. But if there's a chance to make things right, maybe it's worth taking. His words stayed with me. Maybe he was right. Life at the shelter followed a rhythm. Morning started early, with the clang of pots in the kitchen and the shuffling of people lining up for breakfast. Afterward, some residents left for work or appointments, while others stayed behind, waiting for the day to pass. For me, each morning began with scanning job listings on the shelter's shared computer. Finding work felt like searching for a needle in a haystack. I'd send out resumes and hear nothing back. But it was something to hold on to, a shred of normalcy in a life that felt anything but. Ellen became a source of comfort during those long days. She'd sit on the worn couch in the common area, knitting scarves and telling stories about her life. People think you end up here because you're lazy or made bad choices, she said one afternoon, her knitting needles clicking softly. But life doesn't care how hard you work. One bad break, and it can all come crashing down. I nodded, understanding her words all too well. Ellen smiled, her eyes warm. You're stronger than you think, Claire. Don't forget that. Martha announced a job fair at the local library, and Jerome convinced me to go. It's worth a shot, he said, flashing his easy grin. The fair was overwhelming, dozens of booths, polished professionals handing out business cards, and a sea of applicants vying for attention. I felt out of place, clutching my modest stack of resumes like a lifeline. But then I saw a booth for a nonprofit looking for an administrative assistant. The woman behind the table, Rachel, seemed kind, and we struck up a conversation. By the end of it, she promised to call me for an interview. It wasn't a job, but it was hope. Jerome's situation weighed on him more than he let on. One evening, as we sat on the shelter steps watching the sunset, he opened up. My son, Ethan, is 8, he said, his voice tinged with sadness. I haven't seen him in months. His mom won't let me until I can show I'm stable. Do you have a plan? I asked. He nodded. I'm working on it. I just need a steady job, a place to stay. Then I'll fight for him. His determination was inspiring, and I realized how much I admired him. The call from Rachel came a few days later. She invited me for an interview, and Martha lent me a blouse and blazer for the occasion. The interview went well, or at least, I thought it did. Rachel asked thoughtful questions, and I did my best to stay confident. When I got back to the shelter, Jerome was waiting on the steps. How'd it go? He asked. I think it went okay, I said, smiling. That's what I like to hear, he replied, clapping me on the shoulder. Despite the potential job, my mind kept drifting back to the letters from my mother. I read them over and over, trying to make sense of the emotions they stirred. Ellen noticed my distraction one evening. What's on your mind, sweetheart? She asked. I hesitated, then showed her the letters. She read them carefully, her expression softening. Family's tricky, she said. But it sounds like she's trying to reach out. Maybe it's time you let her. Her words stayed with me long after I went to bed. Tensions at the shelter reached a boiling point when supplies ran low. A man named Victor accused another resident of stealing food, and the argument quickly escalated. Martha stepped in, her voice firm but calm. Enough. We're all in this together. Fighting each other won't help. Victor backed down, but the incident left everyone shaken. That night, Jerome said, "This place, it tests you. Makes you see the worst in people, but also the best." I nodded, thinking of Ellen's kindness and Martha's strength. A week later, I got the call. Rachel offered me the job. The pay wasn't great, but it was enough to start rebuilding. The shelter erupted in cheers when I shared the news. Jerome gave me a high five, and Ellen hugged me tightly. "This is the first step," she said, her voice full of pride. It felt like a weight had lifted. For the first time in months, I saw a path forward. With the job secured, I finally felt ready to confront the letters. One evening, I borrowed the shelter's phone and dialed the number my mother had included in her last letter. The line rang 3 times before a woman's voice answered. "Hello. Mom," I said, my voice trembling. There was a pause, then a sharp intake of breath. "Claire." The emotions I'd been holding back spilled over, and for the first time in years, I let myself cry. Talking to my mother was both cathartic and overwhelming. She lived in Nebraska now, working as a caregiver. She sounded different, softer, more vulnerable. "I want to see you," she said. "I've wanted that for so long." I promised I'd try, though the logistics felt daunting. I had no savings, no car, and no idea how to get to Nebraska. When I told Jerome and Ellen about the call, they immediately offered to help. "We'll figure it out," Jerome said with a smile. "That's what friends are for." The days after reconnecting with my mother were a whirlwind. The thought of seeing her again filled me with equal parts hope and fear. It had been over a decade since we'd spoken, and I didn't know what to expect. Jerome and Ellen were my biggest cheerleaders. "Family's complicated," Jerome said one afternoon as we folded laundry at the shelter. "But if you've got a chance to fix things, take it." Ellen nodded. "We'll help however we can. You're not doing this alone." Their support felt like a lifeline. One evening, I sat in the common area with the bundle of letters spread before me. The return address on each envelope matched, a small town in Nebraska called Maple Grove. I googled the town on the shelter's shared computer. It wasn't much, just a speck on the map with a population of less than 5,000. But it was where my mother was. As I scrolled through the search results, I stumbled upon a local newspaper article featuring a caregiver named Margaret Summers. My mother. She looked older, her once vivid auburn hair now streaked with gray. But her smile was unmistakable. Jerome offered to help me dig deeper. "I've got a knack for this stuff," he said with a grin. We spent hours on the computer, looking up bus routes and budgeting for the trip. Jerome even suggested a GoFundMe page to help cover travel expenses. "You'd be surprised how many people are willing to help," he said. It felt strange asking for donations, but Jerome was right, the page quickly gained traction. The kindness of strangers reminded me that I wasn't as alone as I'd thought. The hardest part of planning the trip was knowing I'd have to leave the shelter, and the people who had become my family. Martha called me into her office one evening. "You're doing something brave, Claire," she said. "But remember, you've got a home here if you need it." Her words brought tears to my eyes. Ellen hugged me tightly that night, slipping a hand-knitted scarf into my bag. "To keep you warm," she said with a smile. Even Jerome, usually so upbeat, seemed subdued. "You're gonna do great," he said. "Just don't forget about us when you're famous." The bus to Nebraska was a cramped, noisy affair. I sat by the window, clutching Ellen's scarf and staring out at the endless highway. The further we got from the city, the more my nerves grew. What if my mother regretted reaching out? What if I couldn't forgive her? I texted Jerome during a layover, and his reply was immediate, one step at a time. You've got this. As the bus rolled through the Midwest, memories of my childhood came flooding back. I thought about my mother teaching me to bake cookies in our tiny kitchen, her laughter echoing as flour dusted her nose. But then the darker memories crept in, the fights, the silence, the day she packed her bags and left. I'd spent years burying those feelings, but now, they were impossible to ignore. Maple Grove was even smaller than I'd imagined. The bus depot was little more than a bench and a vending machine. My mother was waiting for me, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She looked nervous, but when our eyes met, her face softened. "Claire," she said, her voice trembling. "Hi, Mom," I replied, barely able to hold back tears. We hugged awkwardly at first, but as the seconds passed, it felt like coming home. That evening, we sat in her modest kitchen, sipping tea and catching up. She told me about her work as a caregiver and how she'd moved to Maple Grove after her divorce. "I should have reached out sooner," she said, her voice heavy with regret. "But I was scared you wouldn't want to hear from me." I hesitated before replying. "I was angry for a long time. But I missed you." She reached across the table, taking my hand. "I missed you too." Over the next few days, my mother and I began rebuilding our relationship. She showed me photos of my siblings, half-brothers and sisters I'd never met, and told me about the life she'd built in Maple Grove. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. I felt a pang of guilt for staying away so long. But as my mother reminded me, we can't change the past. All we can do is move forward. Before leaving Maple Grove, I called Jerome and Ellen to share the good news. "She's everything I hoped she'd be," I said, my voice filled with emotion. Jerome laughed. "Told you it'd be worth it." Ellen's voice was warm. "You deserve this, Claire. We're so proud of you." Their words felt like a warm embrace, reminding me that no matter where I went, I'd always have a family in them. My mother wasted no time arranging for me to meet my half-siblings. They were younger, still in high school, and a mix of nervous and excited when we all gathered in her living room. "This is Claire," my mom said, her voice a blend of pride and apprehension. Sophia, the eldest, was the first to step forward. "I've always wanted to meet you," she said, her smile shy but genuine. Her brother, Jacob, hung back, his hands jammed into his pockets. "So, you're our sister?" he asked, his tone skeptical but curious. "Yes," I said simply, unsure what else to say. The evening was awkward at first, but as we shared stories and laughed over family quirks, the barriers began to dissolve. Over the next few days, I spent more time with Sophia and Jacob. They showed me around Maple Grove, a tiny diner that served the best pie, a park where they liked to hang out, and the school where they'd grown up. "I can't believe Mom didn't tell us about you until last year," Sophia admitted one afternoon. "But I'm glad she did." Her words warmed me, easing the tension that had lingered since our first meeting. While my relationship with my siblings blossomed, reconnecting with my mother was harder. One night, as we sat on the porch, I asked her about the day she left. "I wasn't strong enough," she said, staring at the horizon. "Your father and I were toxic together, and I thought leaving was the only way to save myself. But I should have taken you with me." Her confession hit me like a wave, stirring up years of buried resentment and pain. "Why didn't you come back?" I asked, my voice breaking. "I didn't think you'd want me to," she whispered. It wasn't the answer I wanted, but it was the truth. During my time in Maple Grove, I helped my mom with her caregiving work, accompanying her to appointments with her clients. One of her clients, Mrs. Callahan, was an elderly woman with a sharp wit and a kind heart. She took a liking to me almost immediately. "You're a natural," she said one afternoon. "Have you ever thought about doing this kind of work?" Before I could reply, my mom chimed in. She'd be great at it. And there's always a need around here. The idea planted a seed in my mind. Back in Sacramento, Rachel from the nonprofit I worked for called with surprising news. "We're opening a new branch in the Midwest," she said. "If you're interested, we'd love to transfer you there." The timing was uncanny. I'd grown to love Maple Grove, but the idea of leaving the shelter staff and residents behind was bittersweet. "I'll think about it," I told Rachel, my mind swirling with possibilities. Just as things seemed to be falling into place, life threw another curveball. My mom's car broke down, leaving her unable to get to work. "I'll figure something out," she said, though her voice was tight with stress. I couldn't stand the thought of her struggling after everything she'd done to rebuild her life. With some of the money I'd saved and the donations from the GoFundMe, I paid for the repairs. "You didn't have to do that," she said, tears in her eyes. "I wanted to," I replied. "We're in this together now." Sophia surprised me one evening by bringing out an old photo album she'd found in the attic. "This is from when Mom first moved here," she said, flipping through the pages. The album was filled with snapshots of my mom's early days in Maple Grove, new jobs, new friends, and a fresh start. "I think she's been waiting for you to see these," Sophia said softly. The images told a story of resilience and growth, and I couldn't help but feel a renewed sense of admiration for her. One afternoon, as I sat on the porch, a familiar voice called out from the driveway. "Miss Summers." I turned to see Jerome grinning, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. "I figured it was time for a road trip," he said, his tone light but his eyes warm. Having Jerome in Maple Grove felt like bringing a piece of home with me. He hit it off with my siblings immediately, regaling them with stories of shelter life and his plans to reunite with his son. With Jerome's visit came clarity. Talking through my options with him and my family helped me realize that staying in Maple Grove wasn't just a possibility, it was what I wanted. The nonprofit's new branch offered stability, and Mrs. Callahan's suggestion opened the door to a meaningful second job. "You've got people here now," Jerome said. "It's a good place to start over." He was right. On my last night in Maple Grove, my mom, Sophia, and Jacob threw a small farewell dinner for Jerome. As we sat around the table, laughing and sharing stories, I felt a sense of belonging I hadn't felt in years. "Your family now," Sophia said, raising her glass. "And family doesn't let go." When I finally said goodbye to Jerome, he hugged me tightly. "You're gonna do great things, Claire. Don't forget that." "I won't," I promised, my heart full. I officially moved to Maple Grove at the start of spring, a time when everything felt new and full of possibility. The nonprofit job transferred me seamlessly to their new branch, and I began working as a part-time caregiver for Mrs. Callahan. My days were busy, but for the first time in years, they felt meaningful. I'd wake up early, walk to work through the quiet streets, and return home to dinners with my mom and siblings. The steady rhythm of life grounded me in ways I hadn't thought possible. Sophia and Jacob quickly warmed to having me around. We fell into a routine of family movie nights, game marathons, and quiet mornings spent sipping coffee on the porch. One evening, as we played a chaotic round of Uno, Jacob said, "It's weird, but it feels like you've always been here." His words brought tears to my eyes. "Thanks, Jacob. That means a lot." Sophia smiled. "You're stuck with us now." Reconnecting with my mom was more complicated. The wounds from her absence didn't heal overnight, but we both made an effort. One evening, as we cooked dinner together, she said, "I was afraid you'd never forgive me." I hesitated, stirring the pot of soup. "I don't think I'm all the way there yet. But I want to be." She nodded, her expression soft. "That's more than I could have hoped for." Those moments, small and sincere, built the bridge we both needed. About a month after I settled in, I received a letter from Jerome. His neat handwriting filled the page with updates about his progress. I got a job working at a factory, he wrote. It's hard work, but it's a start. I've been saving up for an apartment so I can see Ethan again. Thank you for believing in me, Claire. You helped me remember that it's never too late to turn things around. I smiled as I read his words, proud of how far we'd both come. Inspired by Jerome's determination, I decided to volunteer at the local shelter. Working there felt like paying forward the kindness I'd received at Haven Hope. The residents were a mix of personalities and stories, just like at the shelter in Sacramento. One woman, Carmen, reminded me of myself when I first arrived at Haven Hope, lost, scared, and unsure where to turn. You'll get through this, I told her one afternoon. It's hard, but there's always a way forward. She gave me a small, hopeful smile. Mrs. Callahan became one of my closest confidants. She had a sharp wit and a wealth of life experience that she loved sharing during our afternoons together. You've got a good heart, Claire, she said one day as I helped her organize old photo albums. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Her words stayed with me, a reminder of how much I'd grown since my days at the shelter. As summer approached, Sophia graduated from high school. The ceremony was a simple affair, held in the school gymnasium, but it felt monumental. I'm proud of you, I told her as we posed for photos afterward. She grinned. Couldn't have done it without you. You've been a good influence, big sister. Hearing her call me that made my heart swell. In late summer, Jerome visited Maple Grove again, this time with Ethan. The boy was shy at first but warmed up quickly as we showed him around town. This place suits you, Jerome said as we sat on a park bench watching Ethan play. It feels like home, I admitted. Jerome smiled. That's all that matters. One quiet evening, I sat on the porch with my journal, reflecting on everything that had brought me to this point. The Claire who had first walked into Haven Hope Shelter felt like a distant memory, lost, afraid, and unsure of her place in the world. But that experience had shaped me, teaching me resilience and the value of connection. I thought of Martha, Ellen, Jerome, and all the others who had been part of my journey. They were proof that even in the darkest times, kindness and support could make all the difference. As the leaves began to turn, my family and I gathered around the dining table for dinner. The conversation was lively, filled with laughter and warmth. For the first time in years, I felt truly at peace. I'd found my place, not just in Maple Grove, but within myself. Looking around the table, I realized that home wasn't just a physical space. It was the people who made you feel seen, valued, and loved. I smiled, grateful for the journey that had brought me here.